The first time my mother-in-law looked at me and truly didn't recognize who I was, it wasn't because of the clothes, it was because I had stopped flinching. That's how I remember it now, though at the time I only felt the heat rise in my face, the old reflex of shrinking myself down before someone else could do it for me. We were standing in her kitchen, the same narrow galley with its spotless counters and the ticking clock that always seemed louder when conversation stalled. I had come over with my wife to help carry in groceries, an ordinary errand that should have dissolved into nothing by the end of the afternoon. Instead, it became the moment everything I had been carefully containing spilled into the open. I was wearing a soft cardigan, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone on the street would have stared at twice. It hung open over a simple top and jeans that fit my hips better than the boxy clothes I used to buy out of obligation. My hair was longer than she liked, brushed back and tucked behind my ears. There was no makeup, no attempt to perform femininity. Just a version of myself that felt aligned. Quietly honest. She took me in with a look I had seen before, but never directed at me like this. A quick scan, eyes lingering where they shouldn't, jaw tightening as if she'd bitten into something unexpectedly bitter. Then she laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. "What are you wearing?" she asked. It wasn't curiosity. It was accusation. I wish I could say I answered calmly, that I explained myself with clarity and grace. The truth is, I froze. My wife, then still learning how to stand beside me in moments like this, shifted uncomfortably and busied herself with the bags. The clock kept ticking. And in that pause, I felt the old internal debate flare up, say nothing and survive, or speak and risk everything. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand how long I had been negotiating with myself. I grew up learning the art of acceptable disappearance. I was a quiet boy, praised for being easy and well-behaved, which really meant I didn't cause trouble by asking for things that didn't fit. I learned early that there were invisible lines around what I could express, lines drawn not just by rules, but by reactions. A raised eyebrow. A joke at my expense. The subtle disappointment in a parent's voice when I gravitated towards something soft or expressive. I didn't have language for what I felt then. I just knew that when I imagined myself, truly imagined myself without an audience, the picture never quite matched the reflection I was supposed to maintain. It wasn't that I wanted to be someone else. It was that parts of me felt unclaimed, unnamed, waiting. As I grew older, I did what many people do when they sense they're out of alignment with expectations. I compensated. I learned how to dress correctly, how to speak in a register that didn't invite comment, how to laugh along when someone made a joke that landed too close to home. I became good at it. Good enough that by the time I met my wife, I believed, honestly, that I had figured myself out. She fell in love with the version of me that existed then, and I don't say that with bitterness. That version was real. He was kind, thoughtful, reliable. He also carried a quiet tension in his body, a sense of being slightly overdressed for his own life. I didn't yet know how to articulate that, only that sometimes, alone, I felt a longing that had nowhere to go. Marriage has a way of clarifying things you thought you'd already settled. Living closely with someone, being truly seen, creates both safety and pressure. For me, it created cracks. Small at first, borrowing one of her sweaters because it felt nicer than mine, lingering in front of the mirror longer than necessary, feeling an unexpected relief when I allowed myself to move or sit in ways I'd previously corrected. When I finally admitted to myself that clothing was part of this, that how I dressed affected how present I felt in my own skin, it wasn't a revelation so much as a resignation. Like acknowledging a truth that had been patient with me far longer than I deserved. Telling my wife was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Not because I expected anger, but because I feared disappointment. I didn't want to become a problem she had to solve. I wanted to remain the person she trusted. We sat on the edge of the bed, our knees almost touching, and I told her haltingly that I wanted to explore dressing in a way that felt more feminine, more authentic to something inside me that I'd ignored for too long. She listened. She asked careful questions. She cried, not out of fear, she later told me, but out of grief for the fact that I'd carried this alone. We agreed to move slowly, to keep talking, to prioritize honesty even when it was uncomfortable. That agreement saved us more times than I can count. What we didn't fully anticipate was how much harder honesty would become once other people entered the picture. My mother-in-law was not an unkind woman. She was generous with her time, meticulous in her care for her family, deeply invested in doing things the right way. But her sense of rightness was rigid. It depended on categories staying intact. Men were men, women were women, and anything that blurred that line felt to her like a failure of discipline, or worse, morality. At first, I hid. Family gatherings meant reverting to old clothes, old postures, old habits. I told myself it was temporary, that discretion was a form of kindness. But each time I did it, something inside me recoiled. I felt like I was lying by omission, asking my wife to participate in a version of our life that no longer existed. The cardigan day was the first time I didn't retreat. Not because I was brave, exactly, but because I was tired. Tired of rehearsing explanations I never gave. Tired of compartmentalizing my own body. Tired of letting someone else's comfort determine my visibility. So when she asked, "What are you wearing?" and waited for me to apologize, I didn't. "Clothes I feel like myself in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The silence that followed was thick. She looked at my wife as if appealing to a higher authority. My wife met her gaze, then reached for my hand. That small gesture changed the temperature in the room. It didn't make things better, not immediately, but it made them real. "I don't like it," my mother-in-law said finally. "It's not appropriate." That word, appropriate, hung between us, loaded with unspoken rules. I realized then that this wasn't about fabric or fit. It was about fear. Fear of change, fear of explanation, fear that the world she understood was less stable than she'd believed. "I know," I said. And I meant it. I knew she didn't like it. I knew it might never make sense to her. But for the first time, I also knew that her understanding was not the price of my integrity. That afternoon ended awkwardly. We left earlier than planned. In the car, my hands shook as the adrenaline wore off. I half expected regret to crash in, to tell me I'd made things harder than they needed to be. Instead, what I felt was grief, yes, but also relief. The kind that comes from choosing alignment over approval. That was the beginning, not the climax. The weeks and months that followed would test that choice in ways I couldn't yet imagine. There would be arguments, silences, moments of doubt sharp enough to make me question whether self-honesty was worth the cost. But standing in that kitchen, refusing to flinch, I took the first step toward a life that belonged to me. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. The aftermath of that afternoon didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through small cracks, missed calls, a delayed text, the subtle shift in how my mother-in-law's name felt when it appeared on my phone. Nothing exploded. Nothing resolved itself either. It was a quieter kind of reckoning, the sort that forces you to sit with uncertainty longer than feels fair. At home, my wife and I talked late into the night. Not in dramatic declarations, but in careful inventory. What had been said? What hadn't? What we were afraid of next. "I should have warned her," my wife said at one point, staring at the ceiling. "Or maybe I should have pushed back harder before today." I turned toward her, listening not just to her words but to the tension beneath them. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. Neither of us did. That was true, but it was also incomplete. We were both learning that doing nothing wrong doesn't guarantee doing everything right. There's a space between intention and impact that can only be crossed by experience, and we were standing squarely in it. In the days that followed, I noticed how my body reacted to the smallest things. When I reached for clothes in the morning, there was a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Not about what I wanted to wear, but about the consequences of wanting it. Each choice now carried weight. Visibility was no longer abstract, it had names and faces attached to it. I didn't stop dressing the way I had begun to. That would have felt like a betrayal, not just of myself but of the moment in that kitchen when I'd finally spoken without apology. Still, I became more aware. More conscious of how I moved through shared spaces, how long my gaze lingered in mirrors, how often I checked my reflection in darkened windows. It wasn't vanity. It was vigilance. The first time my mother-in-law called after that day, her voice was clipped, overly polite. We spoke about nothing important, the weather, an upcoming birthday, the price of groceries. It was an exercise in avoidance so precise it almost felt rehearsed. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, feeling oddly hollow. The conversation had preserved peace, but at the cost of honesty. That hollow feeling followed me into other relationships too. Friends noticed before I said anything. A longtime coworker asked, gently, if everything was okay, because I seemed different lately. I considered giving him the truth, then opted for something safer. Stress at home. Just one of those phases. Each half-truth left residue. What surprised me most wasn't the external resistance, it was the internal bargaining. The voice that suggested compromises I hadn't agreed to. Maybe just dress this way at home. Maybe tone it down in public. Maybe find a version of myself that didn't require explanation. I recognized that voice. It sounded like reason, but it was fear wearing a sensible coat. One evening, as I folded laundry, I held up a blouse my wife had helped me pick out weeks earlier. It was simple, soft, nothing that would draw attention. Still, I hesitated. I imagined my mother-in-law's expression, the way her mouth tightened as if holding back words she believed would be wasted on me. I imagined future holidays, the careful choreography required to avoid discomfort. For a moment, I considered putting the blouse away, choosing something else the next day. Something easier. My wife watched me from the doorway. You don't have to wear that tomorrow, she said, reading the pause. Not if it feels like too much. I appreciated her care, but something in me resisted the offer. I know, I said. But if I stop now, I'm not choosing comfort. I'm choosing fear. She nodded, and in that nod was a quiet affirmation that mattered more than any argument I could have made. The next family gathering loomed like a test I hadn't studied for. A birthday dinner at a restaurant my mother-in-law loved, the kind of place where the lighting was soft and the expectations were not. I spent longer than usual getting ready, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel grounded. I chose clothes that felt true without feeling confrontational, a balance I was still learning how to strike. When we arrived, conversation stalled for half a beat as eyes flicked toward me, then away. No one said anything outright. That, in some ways, was harder. Silence has a way of amplifying imagination. Every laugh sounded slightly delayed, every question slightly loaded. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay present, to respond to what was actually happening rather than what I feared might. My mother-in-law hugged my wife tightly, then turned to me with a nod that barely registered as acknowledgement. Throughout the meal, she spoke around me, not to me. Asked my wife about work, commented on the food, told a story I'd heard before about a neighbor who'd lost his way. I listened, feeling the subtext press against my ribs. Halfway through the meal, she finally addressed me directly. Are you happy? She asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. The table went quiet. I sensed my wife tense beside me, ready to intervene. I took a moment before answering, not to craft the perfect response, but to check in with myself. Yes, I said. I am. It wasn't a defiant answer. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, offered without embellishment. Something in her expression shifted, not acceptance, but recalibration. As if she'd expected confusion, or apology, or doubt, and found none. She didn't respond. The conversation resumed, altered but intact. Later, as we stood to leave, she pulled my wife aside. I didn't hear what was said, only saw the set of my wife's shoulders, the way she squared herself without raising her voice. On the drive home, my wife told me her mother was worried. About appearances. About what people would think. About the strain this might put on our marriage. All concerns framed as care, as love. And what did you say? I asked. That you're not a phase, she said. And neither is our marriage. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how often concern is used as a shield against discomfort. How easy it is to mistake familiarity for morality. I didn't blame my mother-in-law for her fears. They were inherited, reinforced, rarely questioned. But I also knew that understanding her didn't require me to contort myself into something smaller. I began to see my journey less as a transformation and more as an excavation. I wasn't becoming someone new so much as uncovering someone who'd been buried under expectation and habit. Each interaction, awkward or affirming, scraped away another layer. It hurt sometimes. It also clarified. The cost of authenticity was becoming clearer, but so was its value. I was learning where my responsibility ended and where it didn't. I could offer patience, explanation, empathy. I could not offer erasure. That distinction felt like maturity, not rebellion. As the weeks went on, the tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. Conversations grew more direct. Boundaries became clearer. I stopped apologizing for existing, and in doing so, invited others to meet me where I actually stood. Some did. Some couldn't. Both outcomes taught me something. What I didn't yet know was how far this would go, how much it would ask of me, and how deeply it would reshape my understanding of family, commitment, and self-respect. The hardest moments were still ahead, and so were the most illuminating. There is a point in any slow conflict where you realize you're no longer reacting, you're choosing. I didn't notice when I crossed that threshold, only that one day the tightness in my chest eased, replaced by something heavier but steadier. Resolve, maybe. Or acceptance that this was not a temporary disturbance, but a lasting reconfiguration of my life. My mother-in-law stopped pretending nothing was happening. Instead, she adopted a new strategy, precision. Her comments became carefully framed questions, each one polished enough to pass as concern but sharp enough to draw blood if I leaned into it wrong. "Don't you worry about confusing people?" she asked once, as we walked behind the others after a family brunch. "Sometimes," I said. It was the truth. "But I worry more about confusing myself." She frowned, as if I'd missed the point. Perhaps I had. Or perhaps I'd finally stopped accepting her framing as the only one that mattered. What unsettled me most during that period wasn't her disapproval, it was how easily it could still unsettle me. I would replay conversations in my head, wondering if I'd said too much or too little, if I'd sounded defensive, if I'd made things worse for my wife. Self-awareness can slide into self-surveillance if you're not careful, and I had to learn where to draw that line. My wife noticed before I did. "You're carrying her reactions like they're verdicts," she said one evening as we cooked dinner together. "They're not." I wanted to believe her. I also knew she was right in a way that scared me. If her mother's opinions weren't verdicts, then I had to decide whose were. That meant fully inhabiting my own authority, something I'd never been taught how to do. Around that time, I started seeing a therapist. Not because I was in crisis, but because I felt myself stretching into unfamiliar territory without a map. Our sessions weren't about labels or declarations. They were about patterns. How often I'd learned to manage other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. How my sense of morality had been shaped by approval rather than alignment. "Whose disappointment feels unbearable to you?" she asked once. I didn't answer right away. The name that came to mind surprised me, not my mother-in-law's, not even my wife's. My own. Saying that out loud shifted something. It reframed the conflict from a family problem to a personal reckoning. I wasn't just asking others to tolerate my expression, I was asking myself to respect it. The external world continued, indifferent to my internal revelations. At work, I began dressing more consistently with who I was becoming. No announcements, no confrontations, just gradual honesty. Most people adjusted with little fuss. A few didn't. One colleague pulled me aside to say he admired my confidence, though his tone suggested curiosity more than understanding. Another avoided me entirely, as if difference were contagious. Each reaction taught me something about projection. People responded less to what I wore than to what it represented to them: freedom, threat, confusion, courage. I couldn't control their interpretations, only my conduct. So I focused on being kind, competent, and present. Integrity, I learned, is often quieter than performance. The real test came during the holidays. My mother-in-law hosted that year, as she always did, with a guest list carefully curated and traditions followed to the letter. My wife asked me weeks in advance how I wanted to handle it. Her question wasn't about clothes. It was about boundaries. I don't want to pretend, I said. But I don't want to make it about me either. We talked through scenarios, contingencies, exit plans. It felt strategic, but it was also an act of care. Preparation doesn't mean fear, sometimes it means respect for the emotional weight of what you're walking into. On the day itself, I dressed with intention rather than defiance. I chose things that felt unmistakably mine, without turning the gathering into a referendum. When we arrived, the house buzzed with familiar noise, laughter, clinking dishes, overlapping conversations. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Then my mother-in-law saw me. She didn't comment immediately. She greeted everyone, directed traffic, kept herself busy. I recognized the behavior, it was how she maintained control. Eventually, she cornered me in the hallway under the pretense of asking for help. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said, not unkindly, but firmly. You're making things harder than they need to be. I took a breath. Not to calm down, but to stay present. I'm not trying to make anything harder, I said. I'm trying to live honestly. She shook her head. There are ways to be honest without all this. What would that look like to you? I asked. She hesitated. In that pause, I realized she'd never actually pictured an answer that didn't involve me shrinking. That realization softened something in me, not enough to concede, but enough to listen. I just don't want you to hurt my daughter, she said finally. There it was. The core fear, stripped of its abstractions. I don't either, I said. That's why we talk. That's why we check in. That's why I'm doing this slowly, thoughtfully. I'm not disappearing. I'm showing up. She looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for evidence that contradicted her narrative. I don't know what she saw. I only know that when she stepped back, her voice had lost some of its edge. I still don't like it, she said. I know, I replied. And for the first time, saying it didn't feel like a wound. The rest of the day passed without incident. Not warmth, exactly, but civility. That might sound like a small victory. It was enormous. It meant we could coexist without denial, even if understanding lagged behind. Later that night, after the house emptied and the decorations dimmed, my wife and I sat together in the quiet. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I felt the accumulated tension of the day release in a long, tired breath. I'm proud of you, she said. For what? For not making yourself smaller, she said. And for not making her the villain. That balance, self-respect without contempt, was becoming the central lesson of this chapter of my life. I was learning that empathy didn't require agreement, and boundaries didn't require cruelty. That maturity wasn't about winning arguments, but about sustaining truth over time. I still didn't know how this story would end. Whether acceptance would grow, or merely tolerance. Whether future conflicts would reopen old wounds. But I knew something essential had changed. I trusted myself more than I feared rejection. And that trust was beginning to feel like a home. If the earlier months were about exposure, learning how it felt to be seen, this period was about endurance. Not the dramatic kind, not a constant barrage of confrontation, but the slow, grinding work of staying present in relationships that no longer fit neatly together. It's harder, I think, to live inside prolonged ambiguity than it is to survive a single crisis. Ambiguity asks you to keep choosing without the reward of resolution. By then, my mother-in-law and I had settled into an uneasy rhythm. We spoke more than before, but less honestly than either of us pretended. She no longer commented directly on how I dressed. Instead, she focused on what she could still control: schedules, traditions, logistics. She would call my wife to discuss plans rather than include me in group messages. She'd ask questions that stopped just short of curiosity. I noticed this distancing more than I let on. It hurt, not in a sharp way, but like a dull ache you carry without complaint. I had married into her family knowing I would never be her favorite, but I hadn't expected to feel erased in such a specific way. Still, I reminded myself that adjustment takes time. People retreat when they don't yet know how to move forward. What complicated things was how much I'd changed internally. As I grew more settled in myself, the cost of that erasure became clearer. Earlier in my life, I might have accepted it as the price of peace. Now, it felt like a test of whether peace was actually worth it. Around that time, my wife and I began talking more explicitly about the future, not in terms of dramatic ultimatums, but practical realities. Holidays. Children, maybe. Aging parents. Each topic carried the same underlying question: how much of ourselves were we willing to negotiate away to keep others comfortable? Those conversations were tender and difficult in equal measure. My wife loved her mother. She also loved me. Holding those two truths at once required a kind of emotional dexterity neither of us had been taught. "I don't want to choose," she said once, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I said. "I don't want you to." And I meant it. What I wanted, what I was learning to want, was not victory, but integration. A way to exist honestly without demanding that everyone else resolve their feelings on my timeline. But integration isn't passive. It requires boundaries that are both flexible and firm, and learning where to place them was an ongoing experiment. The breaking point came quietly. It was a phone call my wife took in the other room, her voice tense, her answers short. When she came back, she sat down heavily on the couch. "My mom doesn't want you at Easter," she said. Not bluntly, not cruelly, just exhausted. The words landed with a strange softness. I'd imagined this moment before, rehearsed my reaction. Anger. Defensiveness. Hurt. What I felt instead was a deep, steady sadness. Not just for myself, but for what this meant for all of us. "She says it would be easier," my wife continued. "Less awkward. Just this once." I closed my eyes. In that phrase, "just this once," I heard every compromise I'd ever made that became a pattern instead of an exception. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She looked at me, really looked, and I saw the conflict play out across her face. Loyalty pulling against integrity. Love straining under the weight of inherited expectations. "I don't want to go without you," she said. "But I don't want to hurt her either." There it was. The impossible triangle. We sat with that for a long time. I thought about all the times I'd been asked, directly or indirectly, to make myself invisible so others wouldn't have to confront their discomfort. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who would have agreed immediately, telling himself it didn't matter. I thought about the promise I'd made to myself, standing in that kitchen months earlier, not to flinch. "I don't want to be the reason you're cut off from your family," I said carefully. "But I also can't agree to disappear so things feel simpler." She nodded, tears welling. "I know." We decided together that she would tell her mother the truth, that excluding me wasn't a neutral request, that it asked her to participate in something that hurt our marriage. That if I wasn't welcome, neither of us would attend. That decision didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Adult. Irreversible in a way that no argument ever is. The fallout was swift. Accusations disguised as concern. Warnings about regret. Appeals to tradition, to sacrifice, to the idea that family sometimes requires swallowing discomfort. What went unsaid was just as loud, that my existence as I now lived it was the problem to be managed. I listened to all of it secondhand, respecting my wife's choice to handle the conversation herself. Part of me wanted to intervene, to explain, to soften the blow. Another part understood that this was no longer about persuasion. It was about consequence. Easter came and went quietly. We stayed home, cooked a simple meal, took a long walk in the afternoon sun. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like standing in the aftermath of a storm, calm, but changed. Something had shifted permanently. In the weeks that followed, I wrestled with guilt in unexpected ways. Not because I believed I was wrong, but because I knew pain had been caused. Accountability, I was learning, doesn't end at justification. You can make the right choice and still grieve the harm it creates. Therapy sessions during that time were raw. I talked about responsibility, where mine ended and where it didn't. About the difference between being the cause of someone's discomfort and being the excuse for it. About how often marginalized people are asked to carry collective unease as if it were a personal failing. One session ended with my therapist asking, "What would repair look like to you, if it were possible?" I didn't answer right away. Repair, I realized, didn't mean going back. It meant building something new, if everyone involved was willing. That willingness didn't come quickly. Months passed with minimal contact. Then a text. Then a phone call. My mother-in-law didn't apologize. She didn't explain herself either. She asked how we were. She asked how I was. It wasn't nothing. When we eventually met again, it was on neutral ground, a cafe, public and uncharged. She seemed older somehow. Quieter. She didn't comment on my appearance. She didn't pretend everything was fine. We talked about ordinary things until the ordinariness itself felt like progress. At one point, she said, "I still don't understand you." "I know," I replied. "But," she added after a pause, "I can see you're not trying to hurt anyone." That sentence mattered more than agreement ever could have. It acknowledged intent without demanding conformity. It was the beginning of a new, fragile respect. I left that meeting emotionally drained, but clear. This was what growth looked like, not conversion, not reconciliation wrapped in a bow, but the slow expansion of what people are willing to tolerate, then accept, then maybe one day understand. I also left with a sharper sense of who I was becoming. Not just someone who dressed differently, but someone who could withstand tension without dissolving into it. Someone who could hold empathy without self-erasure. Someone learning that adulthood isn't about harmony, it's about honesty sustained over time. That period changed how I saw family forever. Love, I learned, isn't proven by endurance alone. It's proven by the willingness to adjust one's understanding of the world when reality no longer fits old categories. Some people rise to that challenge. Some don't. Most hover somewhere in between. I was no longer hovering. I was standing, sometimes tired, sometimes unsure, but upright, in a life that felt increasingly like my own. By the time things stopped feeling fragile, they also stopped feeling simple. I had once believed that if I could just get through the hardest conversations, say the right things, hold my ground without anger, endure the discomfort, there would be a moment of arrival. A settling. A sense that the work was done. What I learned instead was that honesty doesn't end conflict, it changes its texture. It turns explosions into negotiations, and negotiations into a long-term relationship with uncertainty. Life kept moving. That, more than anything, reshaped me. At work, I was no longer the one who's changing. I was just me. New hires met me without context. Existing colleagues adapted in the way people often do when given enough time, they stopped narrating. My clothing, my mannerisms, my presence became background rather than headline. That normalcy was quietly profound. It showed me that visibility doesn't have to be constant labor, that sometimes the world adjusts simply because you refuse to disappear. I carried that lesson with me into other spaces. I stopped over-explaining. Stopped preemptively softening myself. When people asked questions out of genuine curiosity, I answered them. When questions came wrapped in judgment, I learned to let them pass unanswered. Silence, I discovered, can be a boundary rather than a surrender. This shift didn't make me harder. If anything, it made me gentler, less reactive, more deliberate. I no longer felt the need to defend my existence in every room. That confidence wasn't loud. It was cumulative, built from hundreds of small moments where I chose alignment over appeasement. My marriage deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were still difficult conversations, still moments where my wife grieved the ease we'd lost with her family. But there was also a new intimacy, forged in shared risk. We had faced something real together and chosen each other without erasing ourselves. That kind of choice leaves a mark. I trust you more now, she told me one night, months after the Easter rupture. Not because you changed, but because you didn't lie. That stayed with me. I'd once believed honesty was something you owed other people. I was beginning to understand it was something you owed yourself first. My relationship with my mother-in-law evolved unevenly. There were setbacks. Comments that stung. Long stretches of emotional distance. But there were also small, unexpected gestures. She began addressing cards to both of us again. She asked my opinion about things that had nothing to do with me being a problem. Once, she corrected someone who made a careless remark in my presence, not dramatically, just firmly. I pretended not to notice. I noticed. I stopped measuring progress by acceptance and started measuring it by accountability. She no longer asked me to change for her comfort. I no longer asked her to understand what she wasn't ready to. We met where we could stand without resentment. And then there were strangers, the quiet witnesses who never knew how much they mattered. A cashier who smiled without hesitation. A neighbor who complimented my coat like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. A younger person on the bus who caught my eye and looked relieved, as if seeing me had given them permission they didn't know they needed. Those moments reminded me that representation isn't about visibility alone, it's about continuity. About being proof that a life can be lived, not just declared. I also became more reflective about masculinity, not as something I'd rejected, but something I'd been allowed to redefine. I was still strong. Still capable. Still responsible. I just no longer confused those qualities with rigidity. Femininity, as I experienced it, wasn't an opposite. It was an expansion. A fuller emotional vocabulary. A different relationship with care, with vulnerability, with presence. What surprised me most was how this internal shift changed my sense of morality. I used to think goodness was about minimizing disruption. About fitting smoothly into systems that already existed. Now I understood goodness as attentiveness, to harm, to truth, to the consequences of silence. Sometimes disruption isn't violence, it's correction. I thought often about younger versions of myself. About how much effort I'd spent trying to be legible instead of honest. I didn't resent that boy anymore. He had done what he needed to survive. But I was grateful I didn't have to live that way forever. The hardest moments still came when I was tired. When it would have been easier to comply than to explain, to laugh off a remark rather than name it. Growth didn't erase fatigue. It just gave fatigue a purpose. Even on days when I doubted myself, I no longer doubted the direction I was moving in. Near the end of that year, my mother-in-law and I found ourselves alone together for the first time in a long while. We were waiting for my wife to finish an appointment, sitting across from each other in a quiet room. No buffer. No audience. After a long pause, she said, "I never imagined my life would look like this." "Neither did I replied. She nodded slowly. "I thought if I held on tightly enough, things wouldn't change." "And now?" I asked, not pushing, just opening space. "And now I see they change whether we're ready or not." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't acceptance. But it was honesty. And for once, it wasn't just mine. I walked away from that conversation with a sense of completion I hadn't expected, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. I had stopped waiting for permission to be whole. The transformation, I realized, had never really been about clothing. It was about authorship. About reclaiming the right to narrate my own life without footnotes or disclaimers. About choosing integrity even when it cost me simplicity. I wasn't finished growing. I doubted I ever would be. But I had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning to the smaller version of myself. And for the first time, that felt less like loss and more like inheritance, something hard-won, something worth passing on. I used to believe that transformation announced itself, that there would be a clear before and after, a moment when the work was finished and the meaning neatly revealed. What I know now is that change settles in quietly. You notice it not in what demands your attention, but in what no longer does. One morning, long after the worst tensions had softened into something livable, I stood in front of the mirror and realized I wasn't assessing myself anymore. I wasn't checking for how I might be perceived, or bracing for how I'd be read once I stepped outside. I was just getting ready for the day. That ordinariness felt almost sacred. My mother-in-law and I never became close in the way movies like to promise. There was no tearful confession, no sudden reversal that turned years of resistance into effortless understanding. What we built instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more honest, a relationship bounded by reality rather than expectation. She still didn't like how I dressed. She still didn't fully grasp why it mattered. But she stopped treating it as a referendum on my character. She stopped framing my existence as a threat that needed to be neutralized. When I spoke, she listened, even when she didn't agree. When I showed up, she acknowledged me, not warmly, perhaps, but fully. And I learned something just as important on my side: acceptance is not the same as surrender. I didn't need her approval to move forward. I needed my own consent to live truthfully, paired with the discipline to remain humane even when it would have been easier to harden. Family gatherings became manageable. Sometimes even pleasant. There were still moments of awkwardness, still topics carefully avoided, still the sense that we were all learning a new grammar for how to be together. But the air was no longer brittle. We had survived the rupture, and survival, it turns out, creates its own form of trust. My wife and I carried that trust into everything else. The experience reshaped how we made decisions, more deliberately, more collaboratively. We learned to ask not just what was easiest, but what was sustainable. Not just what preserved peace in the moment, but what honored the people we were becoming. Looking back, I see that the most profound shift wasn't how others saw me. It was how I understood responsibility. I had once confused responsibility with compliance, empathy with self-denial. Now I knew better. Responsibility meant showing up honestly and accepting the consequences without outsourcing my self-respect. Empathy meant recognizing others' fear without letting it dictate my existence. I also became more patient, with people, with process, with myself. Growth rarely moves in straight lines. People need time to revise stories they've been telling themselves for decades. Some never do. That reality no longer felt like a verdict on my worth. It felt like information. If there is any lesson worth carrying forward, it's this: identity isn't proven through defiance or validated through applause. It's sustained through consistency. Through the quiet courage of choosing yourself again and again, even when the reward is subtle, even when the cost is real. I didn't become someone else. I became more accurately myself. And in doing so, I learned that integrity is not loud, transformation is not spectacle, and understanding, true understanding, often begins not with agreement, but with the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear. That, in the end, was the gift hidden inside all the discomfort, a life that finally fit, not because the world changed all at once, but because I did, and stayed.